Story 1. October's Darkest Secret. In the quiet town of Ravenshade, October was more than just the month of falling leaves and cool air. Every year, as the days shortened and Halloween approached, a strange fog would settle over the town. It wasn't unusual to see mist in autumn, but this fog was different. It had a chilling density and a subtle, almost metallic scent. The townsfolk whispered that it wasn't just natural fog. It was the ghostly remnant of Ravenshade's dark past. Many years ago, Ravenshade was the site of an infamous asylum. The building was abandoned decades ago after a mysterious fire claimed the lives of the staff and patients. No one knew what started it, and no one could explain the strange noises that echoed from the ruins afterward. But every October, the fog would drift from the direction of the old asylum and blanket the town, bringing with it unsettling dreams and disturbing apparitions. Emily, a curious teenager with a love for the paranormal, decided she had to see the asylum for herself. She was convinced that the fog held secrets waiting to be uncovered. On Halloween night, she grabbed a flashlight, a notebook, and her old camera, then set off with her best friend, Jack, to explore the abandoned grounds. As they approached the asylum, the air grew colder and the fog thickened around them. The building loomed like a forgotten giant, its windows shattered and walls covered in creeping vines. Every sound seemed magnified, every shadow deeper than it should be. They could hear the faintest whispering, like fragments of conversations long past. Inside, the asylum felt frozen in time. Old furniture lay strewn about, and torn papers littered the floor. But it wasn't just the eerie atmosphere that unsettled them. It was the feeling that they weren't alone. Shadows flickered in the corners of their vision, and Emily swore she saw movement from the corner of her eye. They reached a room labeled Records. On the desk lay an old leather-bound journal covered in dust. Emily opened it, her hands shaking. The first entry was dated October 31st, 1924, and detailed the head doctor's belief that some patients were possessed by an otherworldly force. The last entry, however, was different. Written in messy, desperate handwriting, it read, "The fog comes for us. We've seen them. They're here, watching, waiting." Suddenly, Jack gasped. In the reflection of a broken window, they saw the outline of figures dressed in old asylum uniforms, their faces obscured by shadows. The fog seemed to press in on them, thickening until they could barely breathe. They ran, heart-pounding, out of the asylum and into the night. Back home, Emily developed the photos she had taken. But in every shot, she found something she hadn't seen before. Faint, ghostly figures standing in the background, eyes locked on her. And in the very last photo, a message scrawled in fog on the glass behind her. "We never left." From that night on, the fog in Ravenshade seemed heavier, more oppressive. And whenever October came around, Emily would remember those faces, watching her from the shadows, a dark secret held forever in the town's mist. Story 2. The Lantern Keeper. In the small coastal town of Grimwater, October always brought with it more than just the chill of autumn. It brought the Lantern Keeper. No one knew exactly who or what the keeper was, but townsfolk believed that he watched over Grimwater, shrouded in a long, dark coat with a flickering lantern in hand, wandering the cliffs by night. Every October 13th he would appear, his lantern casting an eerie glow over the sea as he walked along the rocks, whispering names that only he could hear. Those who glimpsed him said his face was hidden by shadows, but if you were close enough, you could feel a deep, unsettling sadness radiating from him. This year, 16-year-old Tom and his best friend Ava decided to investigate the legend. They'd grown up hearing stories about the Lantern Keeper, but had always brushed them off as old wives' tales meant to keep kids from exploring the cliffs at night. But curiosity got the best of them, and so, on October 13th, they set off after dusk, determined to see the lantern keeper for themselves. The cliffs were cold and windy that night, and the waves crashed violently against the rocks below, sending sprays of salt water into the air. They waited in silence, hearts pounding, the only sounds their quickened breaths and the relentless crashing of the ocean. Just as they were about to give up and head home, they saw a dim, flickering light in the distance. It was moving slowly, coming toward them. As the light grew closer, they could make out the shadowy figure of a man carrying an old lantern, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and a long, tattered coat. Frozen in fear, they watched as he approached the edge of the cliff, stopping to look out over the dark sea. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned to face them, his lantern casting a ghostly light over his face. It was worn and pale, with eyes that seemed filled with centuries of sorrow. The lantern keeper raised his free hand and pointed toward them, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak. But instead of words, only a chilling, guttural whisper escaped his lips. Ava grasped Tom's arm, pulling him back, but Tom couldn't look away. He felt as though the keeper's gaze held him in place, anchoring him to the spot. Finally, the keeper lowered his lantern and began to walk away, his figure fading back into the darkness. Just as he disappeared from view, the light of his lantern flickered one last time, casting a brief but clear image onto the rocks. The names Thomas and Ava carved into the stone. The two friends ran back to town, breathless and shaken. They never spoke of what they had seen to anyone else. But from that night on, every October, Tom and Ava could feel a presence watching them, and they swore they heard whispers calling their names whenever they walked by the cliffs. In Grimwater, October remained the month of ghosts and shadows, and the lantern keeper continued his silent vigil, his lantern lighting the way for lost souls, and marking those who had dared to disturb him. Story 3. The Scarecrow's Watch. In the farming village of Hollow's End, October was the month of the Harvest Festival, a time of celebration and laughter. But not everything about the season was bright. At the edge of town, in a barren cornfield, stood an ancient scarecrow. It was no ordinary scarecrow. The townspeople swore it had a mind of its own. It had stood there for as long as anyone could remember, dressed in tattered rags, its burlap face stitched into a haunting, empty smile. Legend had it that every October it would watch, and if you weren't careful, it would move. The scarecrow, known as Old Hallow, was said to come alive under the harvest moon, walking through the fields and watching the homes in Hollow's End. The adults dismissed the stories, but the children feared Old Hallow, swearing they saw its shadow moving just beyond the trees at night. One October, 13-year-old Sam dared his friends to visit the scarecrow at midnight. "If you're brave enough, let's go prove it's just a story," he teased. Reluctantly, his friends agreed, their nerves masked by nervous laughter. That night, with only flashlights and hushed whispers, they snuck out and made their way to the edge of town. The field was silent as they approached, the cool air heavy with the earthy scent of autumn. The scarecrow loomed ahead, barely visible in the faint light, its empty eyes staring off into the darkness. The boys walked up to it, their flashlights casting eerie shadows over its face. Sam, trying to act fearless, reached out to touch it, but froze as he felt something brush against his hand. The others swore they saw the scarecrow shift, just a slight tilt of the head, as if it was watching them. "Let's go," one of his friends whispered, his voice trembling. But Sam wouldn't back down. "It's just straw," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. But then, just as they were about to turn back, they heard the unmistakable sound of straw rustling behind them. They whipped around, flashlights darting, but there was nothing there, just the field, stretching out in all directions under the vast October sky. When they turned back to the scarecrow, they were horrified to see its head was now slightly tilted, the stitched smile wider, as if it had heard their fear. One by one, the boys broke into a run, leaving Sam standing there, frozen with dread. But as he took a step back, he noticed something sticking out from beneath the scarecrow's coat, a scrap of fabric, the same color as the one he was wearing. When he looked closer, his heart stopped. It was a piece of his shirt, torn from last year's festival. He hadn't noticed it go missing, but somehow the scarecrow had it. Terrified, Sam stumbled backward and sprinted after his friends, his breath heavy and his mind racing. None of them spoke about the incident, but they avoided the field and Old Hallow from that night on. The scarecrow remained, unmoved and silent, watching the village from its post. And every October, the children would whisper that Old Hallow remembered anyone who came too close, waiting for them to return.